For the longest time, we've talked about the issues facing this AAA gaming industry. For the most part, we've been talking about a lot of live service disasters. We've seen that more recently with Warcraft 3 Reforged, and obviously Fallout 76 it just hasn't stopped since it released in 2018. But here we are in the early part of 2020, and my big concern is the growing trend of AAA gaming publishers trying to infect microtransactions and other business models into single-player story experiences. We've seen that recently with Ubisoft, primarily with Assassin's Creed Odyssey. That was a major issue. And the reason why it was a major issue was you could spend some money on resources or an XP boost, or you could enjoy a long grind. That game was maybe 20 to 30 hours in length, but it ends up being 50 hours with all of that endless grind, something that really annoyed me halfway through the experience and it ruined the fun for me. We've also seen that before in the past with Warner Brothers' Middle-earth Shadow of War, where the real ending of the game was hidden behind a long grind, or again, you could spend money on the game's loot box system, which was later removed because it ended up hurting sales. And this is going to continue happening. Another good example that I could cite is NBA 2K19 or NBA 2K20. Even though that is an online game primarily, even in the My Career mode you can buy virtual currency, you can boost your players immediately. This is something that it influences people's wallets, it gives players the urge, and that's what these AAA gaming publishers are relying on. They want players to have that feeling, and they just want to get that extra couple of dollars out. And that's really the problem with single-player games, the removal of cheat codes and the introduction of all of these slimy monetization schemes. And that really is the future of this AAA gaming industry. We're going to see more infections and different types of business models that are going to upset a lot of people. And that's why it is important for people to push back on all of this crap, because it never stops at one point. It's going to continue, it's going to keep on evolving into different things until people get normalized to this behavior. Now, in recent years, we've been blessed with a lot of great single-player story experiences that don't have any microtransactions at all. Primarily with PlayStation, they've had Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, Detroit Become Human, The Last of Us, and a number of other games. But in terms of third-party publishers, with Rockstar Games, obviously we had Red Dead Redemption 2. With Electronic Arts, surprisingly, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order did not have any, although they definitely really use that as a marketing tool, which I kind of find that strange that we're now in this place where if a publisher's not going to have microtransactions, whether that be Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order or Doom Eternal, they make it a big thing, or a lot of articles pop up like, there's not going to be any sleazy monetization scheme. Kind of sad where we're at this point, but I want to circle back to PlayStation, because there's something very concerning that they're pushing, and it really could be a problem with the PlayStation 5, and this is something that a lot of people need to know about, and hopefully let PlayStation know that this is not okay. Now, in the last year or two, there's been some really bizarre things coming from PlayStation. As most of you guys know, we talked about this last year, but Sony has been clamping down or becoming very strict on the types of content that is allowed on the PlayStation 4, their new censorship policy. And I don't know if that's because they've moved their headquarters to California and they're becoming more, I guess, not okay with adult content. But as we learned through a number of examples last year, it was primarily Japanese games that were hit by this new policy change, including Capcom's DMC5. And what ended up happening was a lot of these games had to have light flares or certain scenes removed which showed body parts. And the reasoning behind this was because PlayStation was thinking about the kids. Although all of these experiences, all of these games are rated M or above, and kids should not be playing games like this. But regardless, times are changing at PlayStation. And another area that I've been keeping an eye on is live service multiplayer. As some of you might remember, this is something that I've cited a number of times over the last year. PlayStation Sean Layden said in an interview with Business Insider in early 2019, Sean Layden is no longer with the company, but he said one of their biggest weaknesses was multiplayer live services, and he said that would be changing with the PlayStation 5. And he said, I was referencing things like GTA Online, or you look at Call of Duty or Fortnite, or any of those experiences. Not a whole lot of that in the multiplayer side of things this generation. I think that's an area where you will likely see us start to make more noise in the new term. So definitely, times are changing at PlayStation, but in another area which is more concerning is the possible introduction of microtransactions into single-player experiences. We have a new PlayStation Patent which goes over all of that, and there's some very interesting graphics that they included in this filing. From an article from Push Square, PlayStation 5 Patent has some fans panicking Sony's going to push microtransactions on players. And there's an illustration from a PlayStation Patent doing the rounds which suggests that Sony may be eager to push microtransactions on unsuspecting players. The diagram shows a user conversing with their console in an Alexa-esque scenario. In this example, the device reveals that 80% of players beat a particular boss using a specific type of in-game resource. It then allows you to acquire that item, presumably using either in-game currency or real money via the PlayStation Store. And there's the diagram, but it goes a step further with God of War. We'll get to that in just a second. This isn't massively different to the kind of system that already exists in current games. You may find a race too difficult in Gran Turismo Sport, for example, so you have the option to buy a faster car with either in-game credit or cold hard cash. The system that the Japanese giant's patenting here pertains more to the data crunching that's going on behind the scenes. When a player queries the console, it's then able to compare your progress to the title's wider community and offer solutions. And those solutions are, well, you can guess it, it's kind of cheats, kind of not, but it's a boost. Presumably, developers would be able to tap into the technology and utilize it for any other games rather than develop their own solutions, as is currently the case. So all the developers can use this possible model, and I'm guessing PlayStation would get a profit split from third-party publishers. This definitely sounds very horrifying. Now, let's get into the actual meat of this patent, because I have it up right here, and there I've highlighted some of the sections which I find quite concerning. And I mean, this whole thing is concerning, but let's go over the main pieces that you need to take a look at. So here we first have the God of War drawing. It looks alright, and this is what basically the system's going to be about. Players who used Resource E were successful on their first attempt 80% of the time and defeated Boss X in about 1 minute on average. Select Resource E now! And then we have the next one, which actually shows an animation of this possible microtransaction in action. It says, choose Resource E. Based on our simulations, you will have a 90% probability of defeating Boss X on your first attempt. And then we have another diagram showing the user actually obtaining this resource and using it against the boss. Although obviously if you played God of War, you don't actually face this in this situation, but they're using it as a presentation. They're using God of War to try to sell this new patent. And here we have another picture showing this possible system in action. It says, recommended just for you based on your play history. You can buy chest armor for game 1. Players using this armor reduce damage taken by an average of 100 points while battling Boss X. And then we have a potion for game 2. You are 50% more likely to complete stage 2. And then we have Guardian Shield for game 1, which was actually shown in that image. Players using this shield are 50% more likely to defeat Boss X. And we obviously have dollar signs, $1.50, $1.99, 50 cents. Then we have a launch pad for game 3. Players who use this item are 25% more likely to level up to level 42. Now, see, the issue is, even if this isn't something that necessarily is in-game real-world money, it's also something that, no matter what, the game developers will have in effect, and it calls into question, are these game developers considering this model and making games more grindy to influence players' decision to possibly, spend a couple of dollars? And that's really the problem with systems and patents like this. And obviously PlayStation, they'll come out with a statement eventually saying that we're just patenting, we're just looking, this isn't something that we're using now, but it's about the future. And I've been talking about this with all of these patents, from Activision Blizzard to Electronic Arts. So they're not thinking about right now, they're thinking about tomorrow. And that's what's horrifying about all of this. So now let's dive into more of the meat of this patent, which specifically mentions that this is intended, or possibly intended, for the use of microtransactions. It says, in some embodiments, the window may provide statistical data as to the rate of success and the average time to completion that the community of players registered when using the presented resource. I guess that would make all of these games have to be online only. That's just something else that needs to be mentioned. The player is thus provided with communal data relating to the actual effectiveness of the resource as played by a community of peers. So it'd say like 80% of players had success, as I showed in that image before. The player can make a more informed decision to select the resource or not, and can be confident in their selection. In some embodiments, selection of various resources may require a form of payment. For example, by using virtual currency or real money. Imagine that, God of War with gold bars or whatever. That's just, oh my. In some embodiments, the selection of various resources may be in the form known as a microtransaction, which deal with relatively small sums of real money. In other embodiments, selection of various resources may not require payment of currency, virtual or real, but the game system may limit the number of resources the player can select. It is also contemplated that selection of any resources will result in immediate access and use of the resource to minimize the delay between a query is submitted and when a solution is made live. And now in this next little highlighted section, I'm not going to read it. It basically just says what I referenced earlier, which is there's a little animation or a clip of resource E in action, and it allows to, it influences players' opinion and allows them to give a more informed choice. At least that's what it states here in this patent filing. Now next we have some more details on the payment side. It says, in some embodiments, there's a transaction between the player or their account and the surfacing platform or the video game that enables immediate use of the resource by the player. Continues, in some embodiments, the resource, they're rendered based on a rendering profile for the resource based on player attributes. Imagine that. The game automatically, dynamically figures out how you're doing in the game, whether you're a good player or a bad player. For example, each resource may have a variety of ways in which they are rendered for the video game, depending on the character that the player is using and depending on attributes of the player. In one example, a larger character is given a version of the shield that is larger, whereas a miniature character is given a miniature version of the shield. In this manner, the resource is rendered to match the characteristics of the character. Moreover, each resource may have versions that differ in the way that they are used and their difficulty of use, so pretty much just a dynamic system here. For example, when selecting a rendering profile for a resource, the player attributes, including the skill level of the player, play style of the player, and the preferences of the player are considered. When a player is more skilled, they may be provisioned with a version of the resource that is of greater complexity and difficulty to use, whereas a beginning player may be provisioned with a version of the resource that is more user-friendly. So here's another concern that pops up into my mind from all of this, and it really is all about who's going to be using this tool, considering the developers. And obviously I don't trust a lot of this AAA gaming industry to do something that's not slimy and not thinking about dollar signs. And this calls into question, would this system be more dynamic? And say for example, you're a really skilled player, you don't really need any resources, but then you hit a big grind wall, and the game is altered to try to influence your decision to buy some of these microtransactions. Maybe the game's harder for you because you're a more skilled player, while on the opposite side of things, maybe a normal player who's just, making it by barely, the game is less harder for them, and still they're, being influenced to buy some good old resource E or whatever microtransaction that's being offered. It's just, there's so many red flags with all of this. But finally we move to the last page that I'm going to go over, and this is one of my big concerns, another concern on top of all the concerns that I've already listed off, of this potential use in other games one day. It says, in addition to in-game assistance, the surfacing platform is envisioned to also be useful in the context of a virtual store. A virtual store such as the PlayStation Store may have thousands of resources available to players for similarly wide selection of game titles. Imagine Bethesda using this for the Elder Scrolls 6, or Horizon Zero Dawn 2 using this, or whatever the next God of War. It is therefore a challenge for players to have an idea of what resources are particularly useful for them. The surfacing platform is contemplated to also be implemented in the context of a virtual store such that the player is provided with recommendations of particular suitability to their needs. Figure 11 illustrates a virtual store that implements a surfacing platform. Again, this is the virtual store that I presented earlier. The virtual store is shown to display 4 resources: chest armor for game 1, guardian shield for game 1, and potion for game 2, and a launch pad for game 3. Each of these items is surfaced by the surfacing platform according to player game data for game 1 through 3. The surfacing platform may access the game state data for each of games 1 through 3 to determine a current game state for games 1 through 3. So again, this is just a system relying on artificial intelligence to figure out where you are in the game, and then pops up a good old recommendations to buy certain resource E to defeat whatever quest or whatever task that you're trying to complete. But essentially the next highlighted part, this is what it basically goes over, using artificial intelligence with community data to figure out which resource to present to you so you can defeat boss X. This is the dystopian world of microtransactions. Oh boy. My immediate fear is just imagine playing The Last of Us Part 2, or really any single player game in the future. You progress smoothly through the first number of hours, and then a certain quest or enemy pops up that is really difficult. But don't worry, good old Sony is here to sell you the solution in the form of a microtransaction, which could be a new, more powerful weapon only available through this virtual store, or a damage booster that lasts an hour. After that, Ellie's journey in The Last of Us Part 2 continues until eventually you hit the next roadblock. Years ago we had cheat codes, and maybe the next to go is gaming guides or walkthroughs, which won't matter if dynamic AI manipulates core systems. Again, maybe this is not a short-term concern, but I mean, monetization schemes like this already kinda exist in mobile gaming and other genres, and they have become normalized. And this is not the first time that we've talked about this in the past. Activision's been trying to do something similar, as we have this report from Kotaku: Activision patents matchmaking that encourages players to buy microtransactions. Oh boy, the future of gaming is going to be very, very interesting. And Activision obviously responded to that, saying that this was just research and development. That's what all these publishers say, but they're dreaming of this becoming a reality one day, in which you're playing a video game and then pops up a good old microtransaction option, so you can compete with other players. And then, again, the question is always going to be there, is this intentional? Are the developers actually altering the experience to force you into spending this couple of dollars? And sometimes it's actually not a couple of dollars. And this is something that we actually talked about just a number of months ago. EA filed a patent that encourages microtransaction purchases through creating a sense of urgency in devaluing items as you play a game. Also, can't forget the year prior, because Electronic Arts filed 2 patents, which drew controversy at the time because EA basically outlined a system or a plan that would have online matchmaking manipulated to drive engagement and encourage player spending. So rig the system to ensure gamers are playing longer and spending more real cash on whatever monetization scheme EA implements into said game. This is the future, people, and I'm very concerned. I hope people take this subject a lot more serious, because PlayStation, Sony is changing, and I've been a little nervous about some of the responses, some of the things that they've been saying over the last year or two. So whatever this future of this gaming industry is, it's just important to voice your concern about any of this monetization BS that this industry is trying to throw at us, because it's not always going to be Electronic Arts or Activision Blizzard. Sometimes it's going to be publishers like Microsoft, sometimes Sony, and I definitely am very concerned for the future. Anyway, what is your opinion on this patent, and do you think that gamers should be more concerned about this or not? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like if you did enjoy this video or if you found any informative value, and make sure to follow my other social media accounts for updates on new videos. Links are always down in the description below. I'm most active on Twitter, giving opinions on news that I do not always get into video form, so do make sure to follow me over there. Also check out my Discord for all sorts of discussion on games, and again, thank you for joining. Consider subscribing for more videos like this, and I'll see you later.